Perfect. It's going live. I'm starting the webinar.
All right. Good morning, folks. Welcome to our 2024 kickoff press briefing. Just giving people a couple minutes to trickle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Again, we're just giving it a couple minutes for everybody to go ahead and join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Right. I think we've got a good group, so we can go ahead and get started. So good morning and welcome. First and foremost, a warm welcome to everyone here, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Seeger, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Center for Democracy and Technology's Communications Manager and Point of Contact for Press. So today, we're going to be talking about the technology policy issues that the CDT team expects to dominate in 2024. First, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. We'll be on the record today, and after about 20 minutes or so speaking on CDT's end, we're hoping we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, feel free to submit those at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can email them to press@cdt.org. If you're sending along a question, just help me out and share your affiliation alongside it if that applies to you. And we'll take questions up until about 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. But if you have any questions following the briefing, of course, please feel free to get in touch with me and the rest of the press team at press@cdt.org. So we'll share that email address in the Zoom chat for those of you who don't have that, and the names of the folks that you'll hear from today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra Gibbons, CDT's President and CEO, for some opening remarks. So Alex, take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. For those of you who don't know us well already, CDT is a 30-year-old organization that focuses on protecting civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. That means that we spend a lot of time following industry trends, and we also spend a lot of time deeply involved in policy discussions with a particular focus on the US and the EU, and you'll hear from both our teams on both sides of the Atlantic today. All of our work is only impactful if the public really understands what's at stake. And obviously key stakeholders in all of that are you. So we are really eager to be a resource to you. Obviously, CDT staff are available whenever you need comment for a story, but also if you're looking for somebody just to do background brainstorming with, trying to understand trends or dynamics that might be happening around a particular issue. We really do want to be a resource and thought partners to you. So please consider us and reach out anytime. With that, I'm going to let us get on with the substance. Again, really happy to have you with us, and I will pass over to Kate Rain, who leads our Free Expression Project. Kate, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. And hi, everyone. As Alex mentioned, I am Kate Rawan, the director of CDT's Free Expression Project. And 2024 is going to be another big year for online expression, especially at the Supreme Court. 3 blockbuster online speech cases are before the justices, and they each have the potential to change the game for online expression. CDT has filed amicus briefs in these cases and is prepared to respond rapidly to assist policymakers once the decisions are issued. The first cases on the docket are NetChoice versus Paxton and Moody versus NetChoice, and they're being heard together. These cases examine the constitutionality of laws regulating social media content policy standards that were enacted by Texas and Florida. Both Texas and Florida's laws attempt to dictate what content the largest social media platforms must host on their services. This is problematic because it would force platforms to host speech they otherwise would not, including harassment, hateful speech, disinformation, and other concerning content. If these statutes were upheld, they would have seismic implications for online expression. Our brief to the Supreme Court emphasized that when platforms engage in content moderation, they are making editorial choices that are protected by the First Amendment. Content moderation processes are similar to editorial processes at newspapers, magazines, and other publications, just on a much larger scale. As with any other publisher, content moderation involves deciding what content supports the kinds of spaces and communities that platforms are trying to create, and what content does not, as well as taking steps to ensure content on the platform reflects these values. Texas and Florida's laws both intrude on these editorial processes in ways that can make platforms less useful and hospitable to their users. The First Amendment provides strong protection against government attempts to dictate publishers' speech, and CDT argued to the court that because the statutes burden platforms' editorial discretion, Texas and Florida violate the First Amendment. The second case in the docket is Murphy versus Missouri. In that case, state attorneys general and a handful of social media users have claimed that the White House and various executive agencies violated the First Amendment by coercing social media services into censoring protected speech. The lower courts broadly agreed, issuing sweeping decisions that have created confusion regarding what kinds of interactions between the government and social media services are permissible. In this case, we partnered with our friends at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF, to submit an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. The brief notes that classic First Amendment concerns are raised by government involvement in social media services content moderation processes, and that the court rightfully should be concerned about indirect censorship of governmentally disfavored views. At the same time, the brief argues that not every government communication to a social media service is either improper or unwise. Interactions between platforms and governments can be important means of supporting the creation of healthier and more reliable information environments on social media. And they can also diminish the impact of disinformation, spam, and other efforts to undermine the marketplace of ideas. We argue that to alleviate the confusion created by the lower court decisions, the Supreme Court must provide clarity in order to permit information sharing between the government and social media services to occur with appropriate safeguards for speech in place. We also argue that the government is best suited to alleviate concerns about the propriety of its interactions with speech intermediaries. And for that reason, the government should use the appropriate tone in its communications and provide the public transparency into those communications as well. All of these cases are scheduled for oral argument in late February and early March. CDT will be monitoring oral arguments, and as the decisions come down, we are prepared to analyze and explain the court's opinions and provide advice to policymakers as they assess their options. CDT has also been monitoring legislative trends at the state level and engaging strategically to protect free expression when states overreach. One trend involves a rash of laws requiring platforms to verify their users' ages. We have filed amicus briefs arguing that age verification requirements violate the First Amendment and create significant concerns for user privacy. To highlight just one of these cases, the state of California passed a law called the Age Appropriate Design Code Act. The law would have required all companies with an online presence to assess whether their products or services created a risk of harm to children and to report on how they would mitigate those risks before launching any new service. It would also have required all online services to verify the ages of their users or set the default privacy settings to the highest standard for all users. The law raised significant free expression concerns because age verification is a draconian imposition on everyone's access to information online and to everyone's privacy and ability to speak anonymously. The district court reviewing the case enjoined the law because it likely violates the First Amendment, a result that CDT generally agreed with. But the reasoning of the decision called into question the constitutionality of many existing consumer privacy protections. To address this concern, CDT and EFF will file an amicus brief with the Ninth Circuit focused on urging the court to take a more narrowly tailored path toward analyzing the constitutionality of the age-appropriate design code. We argue that the court should enjoin the law because its age verification requirement violates the First Amendment. However, we also argue that the court need not opine on the constitutionality of consumer privacy laws more broadly and should preserve government's authority to enact and enforce meaningful consumer privacy protections. Finally, as recent hearings show, Congress is currently very focused on passing legislation to protect kids' safety online. CDT is deeply involved in policy conversations surrounding the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, the Stop CSAM Act, Earn It Act, and Cooper-Davis Act. We continue to raise concerns about the ways in which these proposals could prevent youth from accessing important information about topics like LGBTQ-related issues, abortion, and racial justice, and the dangers these proposals pose to strong encryption. We also continue to encourage policymakers to reorient their approach towards empowering youth and their families online. CDT encourages the creation and use of tools that help youth better control their online lives, rather than censoring or limiting access to legal content. And with that, that ends my part, and I will hand it over to Miranda Bogan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miranda Bogan. I'm the director of the AI Governance Lab here at the Center for Democracy and Technology. As everyone I'm sure is aware, AI continues to be top of mind for policymakers at the federal level and elsewhere, and certainly for CDT. So I'm going to talk about specifically the executive order coming out of the Biden administration, a few of the mandates that came out through the executive order, and then I'll turn it to my colleague Ruthie to talk about some of the other components of the order. So as part of the executive order, the NIST was assigned within 270 days to coordinate with various secretaries, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Homeland Security, and the heads of other relevant agencies to take a number of steps, including developing a companion resource to the AI risk management framework, specifically for generative AI, developing guidance around secure software development for generative AI, and particularly for what is being called dual use foundation models, or models that have a general purpose but could also be used for nefarious purposes. Launching an initiative to create guidelines and benchmarks for evaluating and auditing AI capabilities, which is a relatively nascent area. Establishing guidelines for conducting red teaming of AI models and working to ensure the availability of testing environments to conduct that sort of red teaming. And a variety of tasks related to differential privacy, labeling and detecting synthetic content and content authentication, and preventing non-consensual intimate imagery. So one of the ways that NIST intends to accomplish all of these tasks is through the United States Artificial Intelligence Safety Institute, which will be housed at NIST, and will involve a consortium of partners, it appears to be across industry, civil society, academia, to engage on those questions. And they've been soliciting partners through early January, and haven't shared who the members of the consortium will be or the announcement of the institute, but CDT will be members of the consortium, and we anticipate an announcement about the institute itself in the coming weeks. NIST also disclosed a comment period where it solicited information about a variety of the different topics assigned to it under the executive order, which CDT submitted comments to. And the thrust of our comments were that while generative AI does pose some novel risks, we shouldn't lose focus on the foundation of risk management for AI that NIST has focused on in the recent year and a half, because that type of infrastructure is necessary to address any sorts of risks that come with AI, including ones specific to generative AI. Something to keep your eye on in the near future on the NIST front is what the scope of the AI Safety Institute is. Some stakeholders have wanted NIST to focus somewhat narrowly on national security and safety-oriented risks that some of the more novel AI systems might present, while others have urged it to maintain that holistic approach that I mentioned, looking at the harms and risks that AI-powered systems are already presenting to people, not just ones that are more speculative. Another component of the EO that we're tracking is the NTIA proceeding on openness in foundation models. They call this widely available AI foundation model weights, as sort of a wonky terminology. Specifically, the EO had called out that worries that AI foundation models could have characteristics of more traditional dual use technologies, and triggering concerns that if certain components of models, specifically model weights, were made available, then malicious actors might be able to circumvent protections on those models and use them as tools to engage in misbehavior. Some people refer to this proceeding as being about open source AI models, but it's more complex than that. And so if you're interested in covering this, please do reach out. We're happy to walk you through it and talk through some of the details and the nuances. And while this proceeding might seem sort of narrow and esoteric and in a corner, our read on it is that it's going to be pretty significant and meaningful in how the administration sets its approach on how to set limits on the publication of advanced foundation models. And this will have implications for a whole lot of things, including external scrutiny of these models, academic research on how to address risks and harms of AI, competition in the AI space, and also how the government will look to define what type and degree of risks might justify more aggressive government intervention on the development and release of advanced AI systems. And this is another place where we're hearing that there are different perspectives on what should be in scope of the RFC. So the thing to watch for here, again, we don't have specific timing on when the RFC will come out, but we anticipate it'll be somewhat imminent. But keep your eye on the scope and the framing of the RFC, because that will be a good indication of how conversations might be evolving within the administration. CDT partnered with NTIA to host a kickoff for their public consultation on this topic, and that the recording to that consultation is available online if you're interested in watching it. CDT will be commenting on that proceeding, and some of the things that we'll be looking out for and that you might be interested in looking out for as well is ensuring that not only the risks but also benefits of open source software, open model weights are considered as part of this deliberation. Including things like greater transparency, support for innovation, implications for security, et cetera. Also, we're keeping our eye out for making sure that the focus of the proceeding is on concretely identifying specific risks of foundation models and determining where open foundation models pose marginal risk to information that might already be available in public and on the internet. This is particularly coming up around novel risks like bioterror, and ensuring that LLMs and other foundation models aren't making it meaningfully easier for bad actors to engage in that type of threat. We'll also be looking into what do we think responsible publishers of open source and open foundation models should do to mitigate the risks that are being identified, identify some of the challenges in doing that, and urge continued investment in the development of norms around responsible release of systems on the spectrum from more closed systems to more open systems. And finally, we'll be looking to see if others are considering what governments can do in the context of precedents related to publishing software, recognizing that government interventions in that context generally are looked to address specific problems and narrowly tailored solutions justified by evidence, rather than placing broad burdens on the publication of software or speech that are based on more vaguely defined concerns or speculative problems. And with that, I will pass it to Rithi to talk about more components of the executive order. Rithi Shetty.
Thanks, Miranda. Hi, everyone. I'm Rithi Shetty. I'm a policy counsel on the privacy and data team at CDT. In addition to the aspects of the AI executive order that Miranda just covered, there are a few other core items that we're watching. First, the executive order emphasizes the federal government's commitment to confronting the current impacts and the evolving risks of AI. Several agencies are tasked with issuing new guidance and policies for the responsible development and management of algorithmic systems to comply with civil rights, consumer protection, and worker protection laws. And in doing so, the executive order recognizes that these risks extend across every key area of people's lives, including employment, housing, lending, education, healthcare, public benefits, and the criminal legal system. Second, the executive order requires cross-agency coordination to regulate AI developers and deployers in the private sector, as well as the federal government's own acquisition and use of AI. So we'll be looking to see how agencies follow through in a couple of ways. First, the executive order sets forth deadlines for agencies to fulfill its requirements, and part of the process for fulfilling these deadlines will include the engagement with stakeholders, making sure that their input is informing the policies that agencies are implementing, especially stakeholders representing the communities that are impacted by AI directly. Another consideration for meeting these timelines is that the agencies will need to establish the necessary technical expertise and staff training to make sure that guidance and enforcement are truly robust. And finally, the executive order also recognizes concerns that arise from the data that powers some of the AI systems that are being used. One area that it addresses is by requiring the Office of Management and Budget to evaluate how agencies obtain and use commercially available information, including information procured from data brokers. Speaking of the OMB's requirements under the executive order, the OMB is also required to issue guidance for federal agencies' management of the risks of rights impacting and safety impacting AI uses. So under this guidance, each agency must designate a chief AI officer and AI governance boards. The guidance must identify specific rights impacting and safety impacting AI uses and specify minimum risk management practices for these uses, including AI impact assessments, ongoing monitoring, public consultation and transparency of AI uses, and remedies for adverse outcomes arising from the use of AI. And other requirements for this guidance include recommendations for testing and safeguards for generative AI and for managing risks throughout the federal government's procurement process as well. So we'll be watching how OMB's final guidance strengthens transparency, including more detailed and consistent reporting in agencies' AI use case inventories. We'll be watching how the guidance ensures agencies cannot circumvent their obligation to implement minimum risk management measures. And because the OMB's draft guidance released in early November focused on agency use, it'll also be important to see how the final guidance addresses the executive order's requirements for governance of federal AI procurement. The EO also sets expectations for civil rights enforcement agencies to coordinate. It requires the DOJ Civil Rights Division to convene the heads of federal agencies' civil rights offices to discuss comprehensive use of their authorities to address algorithmic discrimination. Now, this convening was held on January 10th with participants from independent regulatory agencies like the CFPB, the FTC, the EEOC, who've all been leaders in the federal government's work on algorithmic harms. This convening is part of the EO's larger directive for the DOJ to work with agencies on implementation and enforcement to make sure that the federal government is making full use of authorities under existing laws to protect civil rights and civil liberties wherever AI is used. They'll be keeping an eye on the concrete steps and the ongoing interagency collaboration that agencies will be engaging in following this convening. And separately, the EO also directs several agencies to issue guidance, policies, and best practices for the entities that they regulate to comply with these laws. So, for instance, the Department of Labor must issue principles and best practices informed by input from labor unions and workers for employers to mitigate AI harms to workers' safety, well-being, and compensation. The Labor Department also has to issue guidance for federal contractors on preventing discriminatory hiring outcomes involving the use of tech-based hiring systems. The CFPB should require its regulated entities to use appropriate methodologies for evaluating automated underwriting models and appraisal models for bias and evaluate ways to minimize that bias. The Department of Housing and Urban Development must, and CFPB should, issue guidance on how the laws that they enforce apply to algorithmic tenant screening and delivery of ads for housing and financial services. The Department of Education must develop resources, policies, and guidance for safe, responsible, and non-discriminatory use of AI in education, as well as its impacts on underserved communities. And the Education Department also must develop an AI toolkit to implement recommendations from the department's 2023 report on AI in education, including recommendations like human review of AI decisions, designing AI systems to align with laws and regulations that are related to privacy in education, and developing education-specific guardrails. And finally, the Department of Health and Human Services must issue a plan for addressing state and local agencies' use of algorithmic systems to administer HHS benefits and services, including measures such as assessing qualified beneficiaries' access to benefits and continuous evaluation for unjust denials and equitable outcomes, and adequate notice to beneficiaries, appeals processes, and ensuring agencies' adequate staff training. And there are similar requirements that apply also to the Department of Agriculture's benefits and services as well. So we'll be keeping an eye on the agency's progress in achieving these requirements under the executive order. And on that note, I will turn it over to Tim Harper.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for handing it off to me, Riddhi. I'm Tim Harper. I lead elections and democracy work at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I wanted to have a moment to talk to everyone about upcoming 2024 elections. The 2024 election cycle represent the largest single elections year since the advent of the internet. 60 countries and over 2 billion people will go to the polls this year. And we know that one of the that this is being described as the generative AI election. It is the kind of first major election cycle with these new technologies, and CDT is very focused on the ways in which they'll impact this upcoming year. A quick taxonomy of some of the ways that we think that there are risks from generative AI this year. First being obviously deepfakes, manipulated images and video and audio that we've already seen most recently with President Biden being deepfaked in New Hampshire, which caused nationwide attention. We're also seeing hyper-targeted personalized messaging start to be developed, which allows generative AI to facilitate the spread of hyper-local misinformation at scale. So one of the ways in which we expect this to be used is to take the example of polling conditions at individual precincts on election day, where bad actors could use publicly available precinct location data combined with phone numbers to distribute AI-generated content with highly specific claims about named polling places. So saying something like, FYI, voting at Peace Auditorium is paused because of fire sprinklers. Another key risk that we see coming from generative AI this year is language minority influence. Typically, influence operations have struggled to access specific demographic communities because translating misinformation into other languages was expensive and labor intensive and difficult without having experts who are familiar with the community. Generative AI can target language communities with bespoke persuasion and misinformation content to discourage or direct voting. It can create and distribute many variations of quote unquote news coverage, fake news to advocated in different languages, especially in swing jurisdictions, which makes it quite powerful. But the most pernicious threat of generative AI this cycle is the liar's dividend. As people learn that deepfakes and AI-generated content is increasingly realistic and difficult to detect, false claims that real content is AI-generated becomes more persuasive, which could allow politicians to make claims that their real actions and statements were actually a deepfake. We also see some other risks around things like increased coordinated inauthentic behavior and activity. There's been a number of releases from the major social media platforms, Google and Meta and others, that have released information about the takedowns that they have conducted of major coordinated inauthentic behavior. And that's coupled with emerging circumstances in the community. All of this is done with and can be done more affordably and at larger scale because of the spread of the democratization of AI technology. But given these risks, we can't admire the problem or even wait for legislation. We need concrete action now. And CDT is working on developing recommendations to target key stakeholders, which I'll focus on throughout this conversation, those being AI developers, distribution platforms, political campaigns, and election officials. But first, how these actions are developed and maintained with accountability. First is that commitments need to be developed with civil society experts at the table. We've seen voluntary commitments from the White House that included social media companies, which were developed behind closed doors, and content policies from OpenAI and other developers that have recently been released were developed behind closed doors as well. It's understandable that companies are trying to move quickly, but they need to learn from the field of trust and safety, which emerged to address similar concerns in social media. Efforts like the Santa Clara Principles, which CDT was deeply involved in, spell out principles for transparency and public consultation in writing these policies. In addition to public consultation and developing content policies, a key lesson from trust and safety is that commitments don't work without mechanisms for oversight and accountability. It's not enough for OpenAI to have usage policies. They need to be meaningfully developed with the infrastructure for enforcement, and transparency is an important step in ensuring that that enforcement takes place. Here again, there are lessons from the field of trust and safety about the norms for transparency reporting, mechanisms for allowing independent researchers to understand trends in usage and to spot emerging harms, which should be taken into account. Second, who should be making these commitments? As we talk about company actions, it's useful to think about four key participants, as I've mentioned, those being model developers, the social platforms, and distributors. than speakers, candidates, political campaign managers, and others, and election officials. But we can and should expect different commitments from each of these players. Finally, context for this conversation is really important. These risks exist under new conditions that make this a challenging election cycle. Inadequate platform readiness compared to 2020 has become an issue. Layoffs and policy shifts like X allowing political ads and Meta and Google backsliding on election denial policies have become issues. In the United States, there are partisan court cases and politically motivated congressional investigations that have stifled independent election misinformation researchers. In the wake of Murphy versus Missouri, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has confirmed that they're no longer providing intelligence on election interference operations to social media companies. And we're also seeing new venues for the distribution of these through widening social media channels and the emergence of alternative social media. Newer and smaller sites lack trust and safety experience like Twitch and Discord, and have grown large audiences and balkanized the information environment by fracturing people into new communities. Studies are also showing that alternative social media sites like Truth Social and Parler have played a role in increasing election misinformation. This means that the threat of generative AI to the information integrity environment are coming just as the infrastructure to address those attacks are under attack themselves. Companies and government leaders have to play an active role in rejecting this trend and calling for meaningful investment in trust and safety work. So what are we hoping to see from the companies, and how should reporters be watching this situation? The first I want to talk about is generative AI model developers. Obviously, new technologies to detect and enforce against this content will be needed, things like embedded watermarks to indicate synthetic media, but also developing content rules about the type of text, audio, images, and video that they'll allow to be generated. Obviously, there should be restrictions against developing images that portray sexual activity, manipulated images of political figures, and a use of a person's voice without their consent. Some of the social media companies like Meta don't allow their virtual assistant to create photorealistic images of public figures, and those sorts of policies should definitely be a common standard across the industry. Usage rules for interference and restrictions that limit high-volume campaign activity and campaign activity based on demographic targeting is also very important. OpenAI has recently announced a prohibition on writing large-scale targeted campaigns, while Google and Meta, are allowing the use of their Gen AI, are no longer allowing use of their Gen AI tools for political campaigning. There's also a number of other recommendations for these platform developers around things like disclosures for researcher access, allowing disclosure of customer information, which is similar to the Know Your Customer laws in the finance world, which require a company to establish customer identity and understand the nature of customers' activities to qualify that their source, the source of their funds is legitimate, and that they are using the platform within its required kind of policies. For social media platforms and distributors, there's a range of traditional trust and safety ideas around mis and disinformation that need to be taken into account. Newer social media companies, as I mentioned, places like Twitch and Discord, have fewer content moderation and election policies, and will need to quickly develop those policies this election. For AI content, companies should develop usage policies requiring labeling, downranking of AI content, the removal of deceptive AI election content, and should implement content credentialing like those from the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, and implement actor-level enforcement policies for repeat violators of those usage policies. But election-specific policies are also needed. AI policies alone are good, but insufficient. Companies will need to develop and implement community standards against voter interference and other election misinformation. They should also consider creating things like ads pause periods to give more time to review ads for policy violations before they go live, or temporary blackout periods for political ads during active election cycles. They should include, but in addition to those things, we also need to resource these teams for enforcement reasons. We know that detection in non-English languages is less accurate than in English, and that poses a particular risk given these new generative AI risks. Companies should also commit to reinstating election information centers and privileging trusted government information and verified accounts. We need to address the chilling effects of Murphy versus Missouri. Finally, the role of governments and election officials in generative AI regulation, but also in preventing its worst harms is significant. Obviously, while governments have a role in regulating deepfakes and other mis and disinformation efforts in the United States, there's real First Amendment concerns, as Kate has spoken to. That said, some U.S. states like Minnesota and Michigan and others have already passed laws regulating deepfakes, primarily through requiring transparency and labeling that content is artificially generated. The FEC is also considering rulemaking that would clarify regulations on the use of generative AI in political campaign communications, and CDT has submitted comments supporting this rulemaking. I'm going to move on to campaigns and political figures really quickly. There is also a role to play here in speakers. Political consultants, political figures, campaigns can all make pledges to not to use or manipulate audio, video, and images in a way that misrepresents or purports to speak for a rival, or that materially misrepresents yourself. For instance, you should have to label if you're using a deepfake, in your media communications. Finally, election officials are another source that have a role to play in the generative AI ecosystem. They can, I think there are a number of ways in which we, as CDT, plan to work with election officials, and a number of ways in which election officials should be supported this cycle. First is that we need to boost election officials as trusted sources of information on chatbot tools on social media and in information centers across the internet by transitioning. I think the election officials themselves should also consider transitioning to .gov websites, which CDT has written recent reports about. And authentication stamps on official statements and documents should be included to authenticate that their official communications are genuine. We need to focus on building relationships between local media and platforms for election officials to quickly disseminate accurate information. And we should insist on platform election information centers and election officials having verified accounts on those platforms. We need to equip election officials so they can quickly learn of inauthentic activity and suppression campaigns and false information as it spreads, so that they can rapidly respond and debunk that misinformation. And we need to equip election officials to deal with a flood of auto-generated FOIA attacks and other cyber attacks on their infrastructure that can be generated using AI. I think that walks through kind of a number of the risks that CDT sees in the space, and I will happily pass it on to Averna to give the view from Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for that very comprehensive overview. Good morning in Washington. It's afternoon here, speaking from Brussels. Please excuse me, I'm recovering from, I think, my 5th respiratory virus this season. The joys of having a toddler at home. Today, I just wanted to talk to you about 2 specific highlights of the work that we're doing in Europe. One, the EU AI Act, and then briefly a bit on the Digital Services Act, which is, of course, a very significant piece of legislation that has been agreed. So the EU AI Act is very hard to cover in the just a few minutes we've allocated today. So I just wanted to go through really some of the highlights. The political agreement, as you'll be aware, was reached just before Christmas, but actually the final text, as it's now being called, was agreed on Friday. The AI Act, from an organization like CDT that's very focused on, obviously, protections for human rights and minorities, it is a bit of a mixed bag. And we do think that the way and manner it'll be implemented, and also how some of the provisions we put into practice are very important. So I'll give an example of this. Obviously, the AI Act adopted a risk-based approach, but the risk-based approach at times doesn't really focus on a human rights risk approach. So we have a couple of different layers of this risk. The first is things that are deemed to be such a high risk in society that they are prohibited. The second are deemed as high risk, so subject to certain mandatory transparency obligations and limitations. There are other items of just normal standardization and transparency, like ordinary use of AI. And then at the last minute, there was an extra layer added for foundation models, touching also on issues related to generative AI as well. And so the challenge, like I mentioned, is I'll talk about a concrete example of the area of asylum and migration. In the what's called prohibited uses of AI that are deemed to be very high risk, we have prohibitions on untargeted facial recognition technology. This is something that CDT and civil society colleagues had called for the simple reason that untargeted facial recognition technology poses an extraordinary threat to democracy because of it's disproportionate by its nature. It involves scanning everybody's faces on the street. It has an impact on free expression, on freedom of association. It's really a practice that we see used in regimes such as Russia and elsewhere, and has a deeply chilling effect on society. At the same time, there's actually exceptions to that prohibition in the AI Act. And the exceptions include things like if there's a person who's missing, if there's a threat of terrorism, not even an imminent threat. And there's also significantly a carve out to say that if you can't identify asylum seekers and migrants, that you could actually deploy it in that circumstance as well. And this is why we mentioned that refocus on human rights is important. The way European law works in immigration, there's something that you may or may not have heard of called the Dublin regulation. That means that it's basically a first port of entry rule. Anybody who arrives in an EU country, that's the country they have to stay in. And if they try to move onwards, they'll be returned to that country. The impact of that is that actually people on the move arriving in Europe tend to purposefully not bring identification cards with them. So therefore, when you combine that with the text of this law that says if we can't identify them otherwise, we can deploy facial recognition, you see that could actually end up with a de facto use of the most human rights high-risk technology in a place where there's a lot of vulnerable people. So although there are some very positive transparency measures, and there is language on human rights, when we get into the details of specific issues, areas, and applications, I think that's where we'll need to be really careful to make sure that the AI Act and its application really protects the rights in practice. We've also seen other areas, so it is good. For example, we've seen quite strong language on workers' rights. We've seen recruitment. The area of recruitment is classified as high risk. And that's also, it's significant and something CDT and other colleagues had been keen to highlight. But there are, again, for the high-risk category, for example, it said that fundamental rights impact assessments should be carried out. So that's an obligation on the deployers of the AI to assess whether fundamental rights would be impacted or not. But that's only been restricted to either actors that are covered by public law, so that would be state actors or administrations, or those seem to be acting in an area that concerns public interest. Now, that is obviously, it's very important that those areas are captured. But if I go back to the concrete example of AI in hiring, we know, for example, as the numerous reports by colleagues here have outlined, that there is a very high risk of discriminatory impacts when we use AI in hiring. And those discriminatory impacts actually happen irrespective of whether or not it's a private sector actor or a public sector actor. So if you're being hired into a private company or a public sector. So here's another example of actually the fundamental rights impact assessment would not apply to a private sector usage, even though actually the risk to the person concerned would be the same. So there's a number of areas that we feel like there might be a slight gap in the actual rights protection that we'll have to dive into. Obviously more details, and also think about how it's going, the actual implementation is going to go. On the area that generated a lot of interest near the end of negotiations on foundation models in particular, we have seen, again, there's a lot of positive steps there. There's more transparency obligations, codes of practice, obligatory documentation. But at the last minute, language has gone into the text that said that there would again be derogations for this when it's in the interest for the company to keep company secrets. And we'll really need to get the real details on that to see will that provide a loophole with which companies can actually refuse to disclose information that might have very significant impact on the ability to prevent harms further down the AI life cycle as well. And so that's just some of the highlights. As I said, it's a very large and complex text, and I'm happy to take questions on it. But given timelines today, I also wanted to touch briefly on the Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act, really another landmark piece of legislation, very significant that it's actually coming into force on the 17th of February, just in advance of obviously major elections in the European Union as well. It is, as we had seen, excuse me. Excuse me, I got too excited about the DSA. It's coming into place in advance of those elections, which is quite significant. At the same time, it's challenging. It's such a hugely ambitious piece of legislation. We know, for example, that some of the national enforcement mechanisms, known as the digital services coordinators, not all of them are in place all across Europe. Also, the law is still being implemented. Another concrete example is actually the transparency measures. The European Commission is still considering the guidelines and the secondary pieces of legislation for implementing that. So this will really be a first litmus test of how effective the DSA might be, bearing in mind that it just won't be possible for it to be fully implemented and enforced by the time the European elections come around. Thank you.
And next we'll hear from Jake Laperouk, who is Deputy Director of CDT Security and Surveillance Project.
Hello, everyone. So a major item that's been on our plate with the Security and Surveillance Project for a while and will continue to be for at least the first part of this year is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, commonly called FISA 702. This measure is on an urgent ticking time clock and is something that we know Congress is going to need to act on within the next couple months, which means we're virtually certain to see some sort of legislative action on this topic moving over the course of February and March. This was a major flashpoint towards the end of the year in December when FISA's original timer came up. There was a brief extension made, but it was a major test for the new speaker and a unique clash because this is the rare issue that, while fairly divisive in Congress, is ideological rather than partisan in its divide. So you see a very interesting matchup on both sides of sort of the left and right coming together. Right now, the House Judiciary Committee and House Intelligence Committee, which both passed bills out of their committees at year's end, are negotiating with the goal from congressional leadership of pushing them towards finding a compromise after a contentious debate that happened back in December. The main issue with FISA 702 is that of U.S. person queries. Under 702, communications are collected without a warrant, and serious problems arise when the government then runs a query to deliberately pull up Americans' message from this pool of warrantless surveillance. This isn't just a problem in principle. U.S. person queries have been repeatedly abused to, without cause, pull up the private communications of protesters, political donors, lawmakers, judges, and journalists. Exactly the type of dangers that prompt judicial review as a key safeguard of our democracy. So the critical issue for the legislation and the debate ahead is going to be whether we install a warrant requirement for the government to conduct U.S. person queries. The House Judiciary bill that passed out of their committee does require a warrant. In contrast, the House Intelligence Committee bill does not. The House Intelligence Committee bill labels itself as a reform bill, but the one marquee measure on U.S. person queries and putting into place restrictions on that impacts less than 1/1000th of 1% of queries that are conducted. So it is basically trying to continue the status quo while quite literally in the name labeling itself as reform. This issue of U.S. person queries is an item without any real natural way to split the difference. While on a lot of the other more minor issues, there's probably ability to get to consensus. And from what we've heard so far, items seem positive. At some point on this key issue of warrants, there either is simply going to have to be a warrant rule or there's not. And there's the likelihood that just one of these two competing interests is going to have to lose out. If there isn't a warrant and the House Intelligence Committee approach wins out in terms of the bill that's brought to the fore, we can expect significant opposition from both the left and the right and a very challenging effort to try to get a bill even past the House. During the last round, when FISA 702 was reauthorized in 2018, roughly 2/3 of House Democrats voted against FISA 702 without a warrant rule. And since then, there's been a lot more acrimony developing among Republicans about surveillance and a desire to significantly change the status quo rules. So one way or another, we should expect some sort of big action on this effort to decide whether the House bill is going to move forward with or without a warrant in the coming weeks. On the Senate side, things have been less active. It seems like that there's a desire to wait for the House to move a bill first. But one key area that's worth looking into is Senate Judiciary, which has primary jurisdiction over FISA. While bills have come out of both the House Judiciary and House Intelligence Committee, and a bill that mirrors the House Intelligence bill has been introduced through the Senate Intelligence Committee, so far the Senate Judiciary Committee has been quiet on this front. I think that there's a chance that, especially as the FISA debate starts to come to a head in the next several weeks, that could change. So I think right now, we can expect that this is going to be a key issue in Congress in February and March. It's going to be one that will hopefully resolve the FISA issue after a year-plus long debate, and we should expect to see that focused on these sort of competing interests being pushed from the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, as well as hopefully seeing increased action from the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Great, thank you so much, Jake. So now we will turn it over to Q&A. So we have a first question, and that's from Lynn Stanton with Wolters Kluwer's TR Daily. And so I will have Kate take this one. And the question is, what would CDT's approach to Murthy look like in practice? So how would the government's use of an appropriate tone be enforced?
Thank you so much, Lynn. This is a really good clarifying question. The key question for First Amendment purposes is whether the receiver of a communication from the government would understand the government's communication to have been coercive versus persuasive. And in order to ensure that the government is engaging in persuasion rather than coercion, the government can do pretty simple things, including not threatening regulatory action, for example. But even more simply, the government could take a calm tone in its approach and essentially assure any receiver of the communications that it understands that it is the platform or intermediary's decision regarding what to do or not to do with respect to content, but still advise the receiver of the communication on why the government is making the argument that it is making and raising the concerns that it has, so that the platform or other speech intermediary can have all of the information necessary to make its own decisions regarding what to do with respect to the content at issue.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. Now we have a couple questions from email. The first one is, what are you hearing on AI legislation?
I'm happy to jump in on this one, and Samir, others feel free to jump in as well. So obviously last fall was a really busy season with the Senate AI hearings, high-profile hearings, bringing in CEOs from the tech companies, a wide range of different sectors represented in civil society there as well. CDT participated in 2 of those briefings. We understand that Senate staff are moving forward with legislative efforts now. We are hearing both from staff at the committee level working at issues in their particular jurisdiction, and then we understand that from the leadership level, work is underway as well. Of course, there's a ticking clock at issue here. We're in an election year, and Congress is busy at best with other priorities too. I think the things that CDT is going to be most focused on in these packages is how to move it from just a discussion about funding for AI research, which of course is important. We want resources, and we want those resources distributed across the country. But really, what is Congress looking to do on accountability? And the questions that we're focused on in that are, what do the privacy provisions look like? What are the rules around data usage? What do the transparency and risk assessment approaches look like? And how is that being integrated in? And how is Congress both focusing on those across the board issues that touch every sector, and then sector-specific uses of AI as well. So the use of AI in hiring and employment decisions, do we need an update to existing discrimination laws to address those risks? I think the answer for all of this is watch this space, but again, the pressure is on for timing. And so the big question will be, is there a comprehensive package that pulls together some of the different ideas that have been generated? And really, we need to keep looking to see.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. And just a reminder to folks, we have a couple more minutes. So if you have any further questions, get them into either press@cdt.org, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Next question. So there have been more revelations about bad practices from data brokers, including a new FTC complaint. So what are you watching in this space?
I can take that, although others should feel free to weigh in as well. I mean, I think there is a growing recognition that data brokers are really a key point that people should focus on from a privacy standpoint, both in terms of commercial privacy and the ways in which data brokers compile profiles that can then be used, for example, for targeted advertising, but also in terms of government use of data brokers and their purchase of commercially available information, and then using that for surveillance or other kinds of purposes. And so we're seeing, I think, quite a few different forms of action, or at least recognition. On the on the FTC side, obviously we are seeing greater enforcement, where they are have recently been bringing enforcement actions with respect to data brokers and abuses of information, particularly sensitive information like location information. On the congressional side, we and others have continued to push, for example, for greater regulation of government and law enforcement purchases of data from data brokers, particularly to the extent that those kinds of purchases can evade the requirements that would otherwise apply under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act and the Fourth Amendment, so that if the government would normally need a warrant or would need some kind of legal process to get information about an individual, if they can instead just go to a data broker and purchase that information without any kind of legal process, it really is evading the kinds of protections that we want to have in place for government use of and collection of data. We're also hearing that the administration is soon going to be releasing an executive order that will be focused in particular on foreign government purchase of data from data brokers, with the concern being that the foreign governments can then use that data for purposes inimical to U.S. interests. And so I think we're expecting relatively soon an executive order and potentially a rulemaking from the executive branch on that issue as well. So I think there's growing concern around data brokers. Obviously, if and when we ever get to privacy legislation, that clearly would be a significant component. It is of ADPA, the House bill that was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House Energy and Commerce Committee last year. But I think data brokers is sort of a natural point where lots of different people are saying we need to do more to protect individuals.
And I'll just quickly tack on to that, especially on the surveillance point, to note that the House Judiciary legislation on 702 I mentioned earlier, in fact, does include a provision that bans government purchase of data from data brokers or any other entities that normally would require a court process. So in addition to the U.S. person core issue, this is something that's become a pretty central issue to the FISA 702 debate, is whether it will actually go through to that practice of prohibiting the government from exploiting this data purchase loophole of buying data they should normally require a court process for. It's something that's affected law enforcement, and through a recent revelation that Senator Wyden helped expose, we've seen that the NSA even is exploiting this loophole to buy up huge quantities of internet metadata that should require court process and orders.
Thank you, Samir and Jake. So just one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So are there any more details that you know of on the AI Safety Institute? What type of groups will participate in the consortium, and what are you hoping to see from the Institute? And for that question, we'll hear from Miranda Bogan.
Absolutely. So we anticipate there being an assortment of groups involved, certainly significant representation from industry we anticipate, but we are very much hoping that there's strong representation by civil society actors and by academics who are who would be able to bring their expertise into the conversation around setting some really important guardrails for this technology. It's been a challenge that most of the conversations around how to measure and detect harms in the most advanced models have happened inside organizations where others can't access those models or kind of run their own tests. So ideally, the Institute and the consortium will be a place where we can kind of bring that conversation out into the open, because how we define the metrics and measurements that will be used to determine what constitutes risk, how do we identify harm, is a really central component of governing this technology, and that's something that should be an inclusive process, and we really hope that civil society will be able to have a leading voice in those conversations to articulate the harms that we're concerned about.
Great. Thank you, Miranda, and thank you, everyone. I think so. We are just a little past time. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around and for sharing your excellent questions. So we're going to go ahead and bring the briefing to a close, and everyone you've heard from will be available for comment on the topics just discussed following the briefing in the coming weeks. Again, my name is Elizabeth Seeger. I'm CDT's communications manager and point of contact for press. So please feel free to reach out with any inquiries to me and the rest of the CDT Press team at press@cdt.org. So thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.